Good morning, dzień dobry, and thank you very much for having me here today. Okay, so what I thought you're going to be completely saturated with information about Enigma, bombs, code breaking and everything today, so my session is really the light relief. I'm not going to talk to you about Enigma or code breaking or bombs or anything like that, well, maybe just a little bit. I thought we would ask ourselves the question, did Alan Turing actually ever see an Enigma machine at Bletchley Park? Now, if you've seen a certain movie, that's Alan Turing sitting in the middle there, and various other famous spies of Bletchley Park. You'll see there are many scenes in which Alan Turing is seen sitting at an Enigma machine, apparently doing things which might or might not include code breaking. So, how true is that kind of image that you have there? Well, I need to go back in time a little bit. I'm going to go back first of all to the 4th of September 1939, when Alan Turing first arrived at Bletchley Park. This photograph was taken probably around about 1938, maybe 1939. There's some doubt about it. Alan Turing is not in that photograph. These are the early team from Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, known as MI6, and they're arriving at Bletchley Park to check out the suitability of the place. And those of you who are British will remember that this photograph is called Captain Ridley's Shooting Party, which was the cover name given to why there should be a whole bunch of people wearing suits from London turning up at a disused country house somewhere very obscure in the South Midlands. Of course, on arrival at Bletchley Park, one was expected to meet this gentleman. This is Alistair Denniston, the then head of the Government Code and Cipher School, and you were taken into his office, which is just inside the front door and on the left, and you were expected to sign the Official Secrets Act to reinforce the idea that everything you learned at Bletchley Park was a deadly secret, and something completely horrible would happen to you if you were to divulge anything about what you were doing there, anything that you had learned, anything at all, really. Okay, so Alan Turing turns up at this place on the 4th of September 1939, which, if you're in Poland, you will recognise to be the 4th day of the war. If you're British, you will recognise to be the 2nd day of the war. He was not a complete novice on the Enigma problem. He had been sent on a code-breaking course in January 1939, and at the end of that course he was assigned to the Enigma team working with Dilly Knox, who I will introduce you to in a moment. And this is quite interesting because, first of all, it shows you that the British knew about Enigma and were thinking about Enigma and had recruited people like Alan Turing several months before the war began. And it's only when the war actually started they were moved to their hostilities location at Bletchley Park. But does that imply that the British knew all about Enigma in January 1939? And the answer is absolutely no, they didn't. No, really they knew very little about Enigma in January 1939, and in particular there were two problems that the British did not understand properly. First of all, they did not know how the rotors, what in the video we call the wheels, but I think these days we tend to call them the rotors, but how the wiring in the coding wheels, the rotors, was actually connected. Each rotor acts as a scrambler, so each rotor turns one letter into something else, and that depends on the wiring inside each of them. The British did not know how those rotors were wired. The other thing is, they did not understand this device on the front. And I'll read to you in a second from a notes they prepared in late 1938 on this subject, that this plug board was totally confusing to them, and in particular the problem was, if you remember, when you press on a key, the electricity goes from the keyboard into the plug board before it goes to the set of three rotors. So there's another wiring challenge here, which the British called the Quertsu, and if you will excuse me, I'm going to just spend 2 minutes talking about the Quertsu, because it reveals the depth of the British ignorance about the machine. The fact that they named the problem the Quertsu shows how ignorant they were. There are two wiring problems here. One is how the wiring changes between the keyboard and the plug board. If you press Q, does the electricity go to Q or does it go to somewhere else? And then there's another problem. When the electricity leaves the plug board, it has to go to the entry plate where the three rotors are. And then there's another wiring problem there. If it leaves at Q, does it go to Q or does it go to somewhere else? In the commercial version of Enigma machines, which you could go into MPIC and you could go and buy an Enigma machine, it would probably not be available in MPIC, but you could go and buy commercial Enigma machines on the market. They did not have plug boards. So the British had one of these old machines, these commercial machines, and they knew that when you pressed Q, the wiring took you to Q on the entry plate of the where the three rotors were. But with this extra device on the front of the machine, as I explained, that gives you these two extra wiring problems. Well, it was a fairly simple deduction that to get from the keyboard to the plug board, Q would go to Q, because otherwise it would make the whole cross wiring extremely confusing for the person setting the machine up. So that was a fairly good guess, that Q would go to Q on the plug board. But what about when the electricity leaves the plug board and goes to the entry plate? And here they knew that the Germans had wired it differently from the commercial machine. Q did not go to Q, W did not go to W, so what was the wiring pattern? There are 26 factorial different ways of answering that particular question. Let me fast forward to the answer, which was guessed by Marian Rejewski in 1932. Marian Rejewski, having been brought up as a child in Poznan, which was then, of course, German-speaking part of the German Empire, Marian Rejewski being bilingual and knowing German psychology rather well, said, do you know what? If I were German, I would do this methodically. Q would go to A, W would go to B, E would go to C, we would do this alphabetically, and actually that turned out to be the right answer. So out of 26 factorial options, Marian Rejewski guessed the right one. He was no fool. Now, I said that the reason that the British had named this problem the Quertsu shows their ignorance of the problem. Because the problem is not to do with the layout of the keys on the keyboard, which is how they have named the problem. It is to do with the entry into the entry plate of the three rotors and how the electricity leaves the plug board. Of course, if you press Q, by the time it's gone through the plug board, it may well come out as something completely different. So to call the problem after the layout of letters on the keyboard is looking at the problem the wrong way around. The French had actually got there a bit faster, and the French called this the problem of the couronne fixe, which was the what they call it, the fixed crown, around which is a sort of visual idea of the connections on the entry plate. So I find this quite interesting. I think this is a bit of a giveaway about the state of the British ignorance. And just to prove that I'm not making this up, you probably can't read this, but this document on the left-hand side, which is in the UK National Archives, it was produced in late 1938 when the British started talking to the French about the Enigma problem. And it's not very long, so I'll just read it out to you. It says, in 1931, we were provided by the French with photographs and directions for use of the German Army Enigma machine. Photographs show an attachment on the front of the machine which does not appear on the model available to the public. The directions given do not fully explain the function of this attachment, which is still not understood here. And then it says, can the French be asked to give us all the information regarding the following points? A, full details of all devices additional to or differing from the market model. B, what are the army practice with regard to the following? Fitting new drums, so they mean the rotors, changing the order of the drums, moving the tyres, which are, I think these days we call the ring setting on the rotors, periodical alteration or resetting of the device or devices referred to under paragraph A, so that would be presumably the plug board, and so forth. So then there's another page which I won't bore you with, but this shows you that by the time Alan Turing is sent off from this code-breaking course in January 1939, the British are still deeply ignorant about the working of the machine. They are not yet in a position to devise code-breaking techniques because they don't actually understand the hardware. They can't start on the software problem because they don't understand the hardware. Now you've been wondering who the gentleman in the spectacles is in the middle of the picture and what he has got to do with it. This is Gustave Bertrand. He is the head of the Department of French Military Intelligence, which is essentially engaged in buying and selling of code books and buying and selling of know-how relating to secret ciphers. And he is a key figure in this story, because without him, it would not have been possible for the British to solve the problems about how the Enigma machine was set up. What he managed to do in late 1938 was convince the British, who were very sniffy and xenophobic, very unwilling to engage in discussion with people of different nationalities. He managed to persuade the British to come to a three-country conference in Paris where he was going to introduce the British to the senior figures in the Polish Cipher Bureau. And this was absolutely significant because, well, we all know what happens next, but for 6 or 7 years, Bertrand had been liaising with Guido Lange, his opposite number from the Polish Cipher Bureau, and he knew that he had been sharing information with the Polish Codebreakers, and he was hoping that this might lead to a more fruitful sharing of know-how and a further relationship. And this letter on the right is Bertrand has got his boss, Louis Rivet, to write to Stuart Minges, who is the number 2 at MI6, to try and set up this meeting. And this letter, which I found in the French archives a year or two back, is the thing that sets the whole thing off. And frankly, this is where it all begins, because since Bertrand had begun that liaison with the Polish Codebreakers, the Polish Cipher Bureau, back in the early 1930s, this is what has enabled the Polish Codebreakers, and in particular Marian Rejewski, to begin cracking the Enigma problem. Now, that meeting in Paris in January 1939 really did not produce anything particularly fruitful in terms of information exchange. But what it did do is it enabled, in particular, the Polish Codebreakers to look into the eyes of the British team and see whether these were competent people or not. And in particular, although he was very eccentric and probably rather difficult to deal with, they saw in Dilly Knox, whose photograph I have there on this slide, They saw in Dilly Knox somebody who actually knew what he was talking about. They saw somebody who really understood the nature of the Enigma problem, even if he'd misdefined this problem of the Quertzu. And that meant that 6 months later, when war was imminent, they had the confidence to convene a second three-country conference at which all the information and knowledge that the Polish team had accumulated over the years was handed over. There's a big story about this, and we haven't got time to do all the detail on it, but the list on the right is the list of things which the Polish team shared with the French and the British at that meeting in July 1939, which includes things like their own bomb technology, the new cipher techniques being used by the Germans, the method of Rejewski's sheets, the machine called the cyclometer, and so forth, and obviously including all the information about how the rotors were wired and the famous and their solution of the problem of the Quertzu, that it was A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Knox was not happy about this. In fact, Knox was absolutely furious. He'd just been told the answer to the problems that he'd been working on for years and years and years. If you are a serious mathematician or codebreaker, to be told the answers that are in the back of the book before you've had a chance to get your teeth into the problem is the thing that makes you unbelievably furious. And so he goes back to his hotel room in the Hotel Bristol in Warsaw, and he writes down this quite extraordinary letter to Alistair Denniston, who incidentally is in the next door room, so he could have gone and talked to him about it. He doesn't. He writes it down on this letterhead, which is great because for people like me, this letter is still in the National Archives in London, and so I can go and look at it. He says, "My dear Alistair, let's get this straight. The Poles have got the machine out by luck. He does not believe that they could possibly have done it by mathematical analysis the way that Rejewski did." And then it goes on like this for a page or two. I think it's a good thing that Knox wrote that letter, because by the time he finished writing the letter, he somehow got the anger out of his system. So the second day of the meeting at a period just outside Warsaw was a very successful meeting, and he was able to understand all the techniques that the Polish codebreakers had been using, and they had a much more fruitful, positive, more of an academic conference type of a meeting, not sitting there in the corner fuming because he'd been told the answers were already in the back of the book. This is a very short, I guess, summary of some of the things that are in my new book, which Roger was kind enough to draw attention to. I shall leave some cards outside in case you're interested. If you prefer a Polish language edition, you have to wait till March, but we think there will be a Polish language edition available then. Meanwhile, you can get hold of the English language one, presumably on Amazon. Okay, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Polish Codebreakers, but I think Marek Grajek is going to do a bit more later, so I'll do this bit very quickly. This is Marian Rejewski and his colleague Jerzy Rejewski, and for all that long period of the 1930s, these are the guys who had actually been doing all the intellectual brain power to unravel the problem of the Enigma machine. This document by Rejewski, this is just a page from it, is written in two languages that I do not speak. One of them is Polish and the other one is mathematics. But the point here is that Rejewski's approach was to reduce the complexity of the Enigma machine into equations. These are not ordinary algebra, these are permutation equations, and he had essentially paid a lot of attention in his mathematics class and knew how to manipulate equations with permutations. You can't do it using standard algebra, and the fact that he was able to solve his equations was, I think, one of the most amazing achievements of mathematical cryptanalysis of the 20th century. I think Rejewski deserves a lot of credit as well, because his mind was, I think, slightly different from Rejewski's. He was really not on the analytical side, he was more on the code breaking side. He was trying to find solutions for the to the problem of how the Germans were setting up their machines every day, and he was able to think of these mechanical techniques for solving some of the problems. So he invented a whole range of code breaking techniques, which I won't go into today. And then, of course, once they had solved the problem of the wiring of the machine, they needed to get hold of some Enigma machines so that they could start decoding messages. The machine on the left is a standard 3-rotor Enigma machine with a plug board. So is the machine on the right, except the machine on the right looks odd. Probably you can see from where you're sitting that the keyboard is in alphabetical order, not Quertzu. And you will see that the plug board is in a funny place, it's at the back. And the reason that this machine is different from a standard Wehrmacht Enigma machine is that this is an example of a machine built to a Polish design, because once Rejewski had worked out what the wiring was, then they sent off some orders to their friendly factory in Warsaw, an electronics factory called the Ava factory, and they were placing orders for what are effectively reconstructed Enigma machines. It's not a replica, it's not trying to look like an Enigma machine. What it's trying to do is to replicate the effect of an Enigma machine. That particular machine is currently in London. It's one of a very small number of surviving Polish design replica Enigma machines. This one was probably built in France in 1940, maybe 1941, and it's at the Józef Pilsudski Institute in London. This is quite interesting because I'm getting closer to the answer to my question: did Alan Turing see an Enigma machine at Bletchley Park? After that meeting at Piri, where Knox nearly threw out a 3-country alliance because he was angry about the answers being in the back of the book, one of the gifts of the Polish Cipher Bureau to the French and to the British was one of these fake Enigma machines that they had made in the Ava factory. And so one day, in August 1939, Gustave Bertrand came on the boat train to Victoria Station in London with one of these machines in his suitcase. That machine had come to him in Paris in the diplomatic bag from Warsaw, and he was able to hand it to Stuart Menzies so that it could go to Bletchley Park, and that will have happened before the war began. But that's not a real Enigma machine, that's a Polish fake. So I'm fairly confident that Alan Turing would have seen one of those fairly soon after his arrival at Bletchley Park. But we know from the state of ignorance of the Government Code and Cipher School before that meeting at Piri that the British had never seen a Wehrmacht Enigma machine, because otherwise they wouldn't have had all these stupid questions about how it was wired. So that is a half answer to my question, it's not a complete answer. After September 1939, we are technically in Britain in a state of war, though those of you from Poland will realise that the British and the French did not really get properly involved in World War II until the year after, many months after the fall of Poland. The Polish Codebreakers, meanwhile, had escaped from Poland and found themselves at this place called the Château de Vignoles, just outside Paris, working for our good old friend Gustave Bertrand, and at this point, using the cardboard sheets method of Henryk Rejewski, another famous member of the Polish code-breaking team. They were using this technique to break Enigma messages in partnership with Bletchley Park. So at this point in the war, I'm talking about the first 6 months of 1940, I have got a true three-country cooperation going on. There's a teleprinter link between the Chateau de Vignoles and Bletchley Park. They are sharing the settings of the Enigma machine that they have found using Rejewski's sheets method. And this is at a point in history where the Turing-Welshman bomb does not yet exist. It's been designed, but it's in the hands of the engineers and it's being built at that point. This is the only feasible technique for breaking Enigma at this stage. And it's actually pretty successful. It's successful enough to give French military authorities information about what the Germans are going to do, and once the invasion of France begins in May of 1940, it's giving them day-to-day tactical information which the French do absolutely nothing with. So let me give you an example. Dr. Crike is wagging his finger. He says I'm getting this wrong, so he can do the corrections later. But it's quite clear from the decrypted messages that we've still got that the Germans were sending messages about their plans to bomb various airfields in the Paris area. They were giving details of time and place of the raids, the number of aircraft that were going to be involved, and the French, having been given the decrypts with all this detailed, very precise information, did absolutely nothing with it. And the codebreakers, both the Polish and the French codebreakers, were in despair because they'd been feeding absolutely priceless, accurate intelligence, and the French generals were, for whatever reason, incapable of doing anything useful with it. As we know, the Battle of France was lost, but shortly after that, the bomb, which I've got a very attractive photograph of the bomb rebuild, which you can see in very good detail there, came into operation at Bletchley Park midway through 1940, and from then on we know that the code breaking switched to the bomb method, and there's Alan Turing looking at his creation, and obviously with great success for the rest of the war. But I still haven't told you whether Alan Turing has seen an Enigma machine yet, so what's the answer to this? Well, I think the answer is this. I might be wrong, this is guesswork, but I'm confident that an Enigma machine reached Bletchley Park after the 9th of May 1941. And the reason I know that is that on the 9th of May 1941, there was a convoy battle near Iceland involving this U-boat, U-110, which was depth charged, and the captain died in the attack, and the leaderless crew abandoned ship without following the full procedure for destroying the Enigma machine and the secret documents that went with it. And the captain of the attacking destroyer sent this gentleman, who was called Lieutenant David Baum, over in a rowing boat and as a boarding party to go and see what had been left on this U-boat, and he entered this abandoned U-boat and found a machine that looked a bit like a typewriter. And he also found something that he thought was much more valuable than the typewriter, which was a map of the North Atlantic ruled into squares with the German coded grid numbers, which were being used instead of latitude and longitude bearings to direct U-boats to
particular location. So he thought he struck gold with the grid squares chart, which actually the British knew all about anyway. So that wasn't. But so the typewriter-like thing was number 2 in his idea of what was something of great importance. But actually, what was probably more significant than either the chart or the typewriter-like machine was a piece of paper like this one I have on the slide here, which is the chart showing how the U-boats were to set up their Enigma machines every day, and they used a different method from the German Army and Air Force, which involved bigram tables. This reconstructing the bigram tables was virtually impossible for the British to do without having stolen at least one of these charts. The problem with these charts is that this pink paper and this red ink, this is a security device. On contact with seawater, the red ink dissolves instantly, and so the fact that one of these charts actually managed to get back across the sea and find its way back to Bletchley Park was a great breakthrough and a real help to the British Codebreakers. As well as the pink piece of paper and the grid chart, the typewriter-like object went to Bletchley Park, and we all know that the typewriter-like object was an Enigma machine. So I'm fairly sure that at that stage, Bletchley Park had received a whole Enigma machine and a complete set of rotors. They may have got one earlier in the war, but that is at least that's verifiable that they definitely had one soon after that. It's possible that they had one earlier, but that I can't prove. By this stage, what's Alan Turing doing? 1941, he's still working on Naval Enigma, but not for much longer. By 1942, he has moved on into essentially a completely different area of secret intelligence. He has been tasked with getting involved in the problem of the encipherment of radio telephone calls. There's a problem going on here. The Germans have been listening to telephone calls being made by people like Winston Churchill, and the scrambling system that was in use before the war was extremely insecure, and the Germans, this is not trivial, but they had deciphered the scrambling technique, and so they were able to listen in on all Churchill's phone calls with Roosevelt, some of which were of very considerable tactical importance. The British were aware that the scrambler telephone was insecure, but they needed a solution to it, and it took until late 1942 before the Americans came up with an answer, which was about the size of this room. It was absolutely colossal machine. And they sent Alan Turing over to go and check out whether this was secure. And Alan Turing came up with an alternative device, which he spent the rest of the war working on, which was called Delilah, which was the same size as an Enigma machine, rather than the size of this room, which would enable secure phone calls to happen. And there's another project going on probably in the room behind where our colleagues at the National Museum of Computing are. There's John Harper and his team have got a little project going on, which is to try and reconstruct this Alan Turing speech encryption device called Delilah, and it's not completed yet, but I think it. I don't know, I'm looking at people around here. I think it works, even if it's not complete. But so that's an interesting little footnote to that. So I also wanted to show you what Bletchley Park has become like by this stage. That's a drawing showing what Bletchley Park, a map of Bletchley Park in about 1943. You can still see the lake
in the middle. That's effectively the surviving part of the landscape grounds, and just to the left of it, the mansion house, which is where we saw Captain Ridley's shooting party. And look at what's happened to the rest of the grounds. It's been covered in huts and brick buildings and blocks where the code breaking is going on. It's basically turned into a factory. And it's turned into a factory because the process of code breaking has become mechanized, standardized. It's got thousands, literally thousands of people working on it. And therefore, I think it's not surprising that people like Alan Turing, who don't fit into a sort of a factory, are being sent off to go and work on different research projects elsewhere. So that's probably a good point to bring this to a close, because I've taken Alan Turing away from Enigma machines completely. So after this point, I don't think he's looking at Enigma at all. But I think I have probably convinced you that at some stage he did see an Enigma machine at Bletchley Park, but not in the way that Benedict Cumberbatch is doing with Kira in that movie. Anyway, so thank you for listening, and I'll hand you back to Roger.
If we use this one and this one, Dermot's very happy to answer questions, so if you just put your hand up, we'll work our way around the room. But questions to Dermot?
No, they want Benedict Cumberbatch. Please.
Well, it's not a question. Maybe we'll bring a question afterwards, but it's a comment.
Just for the purpose of the streaming.
As the teacher of the Technical Committee of Foundation of Computer Science, and after this breathtaking, fascinating talk, I just wanted to remind people, probably the students are aware, but maybe not all the people, that Alan Turing is not only, was the leading of the code breaking team, but for mathematicians, is it has made a breakthrough in the way we look at what computation is, which is at the same level of the breakthrough of Einstein did for the comprehension of what's time and space. And of course, this was really, I enjoyed very much your talk, and I know what is the importance of the war and for, but I'm afraid that this part of Alan Turing genius is a bit put aside by all this story, and I wanted just to bring it.
Well, thank you for that. So I was not asked, and there's a good reason for this. I was not asked to talk about the Entscheidungsproblem and Alan Turing's paper on computable numbers, because even when I talk about Enigma, I have people like Dr. Groik standing up saying, no, that's not quite right. If I start to talk about the paper on computable numbers, I have everybody standing up saying, no, that's not even vaguely right. So I'm not. Thank you for your comments. And I leave it to those who are much cleverer than me to talk about computable numbers. I talk about pieces of machinery that I vaguely understand. So.
It does not refer perhaps to your exactly
your speech was complete, so my question does not refer exactly to what you've been talking about. However, I would like to know something about the Soviet attempts to solve Enigma problem. Is there any knowledge about how far they went trying to find out or what was their contribution when we can. It was not shared with allies, I suppose, but anyway, there must be some attempts during the 30s to catch up with this.
Okay, this is a very, very good question, and I've only begun to research this, but so I will tell you everything that I know, and it will not take very long. First of all, the British were not at all inclined to share with the Soviet Union what they had been doing at Bletchley Park. That was the official story. Of course, one of the people who was working for MI6 at the time was Philby, who was very happily telling his bosses in Moscow what was going on at Bletchley Park. So I am fairly confident that the Russians knew that Bletchley Park had found a solution to the Enigma problem. That wasn't your question. The Russians probably found a solution to the Enigma problem, but I don't think it was as sophisticated as the bomb technique. And the reason that we know this is that although the Russians have kept as a very great secret the successes that they had on code breaking against the Germans during World War II, there have been some hints in some memoirs by some of the Russian generals that they knew or that they were able to read some German messages. Now, you have to be careful when you understand these comments, because Enigma was not the only coding technique that the Germans were using. So the fact that the Russians were able to break the easy German codes is not a surprise at all. So we're looking specifically for evidence that they had succeeded against Enigma. But as I say, I think there are some indications that they had made some success. We know they had captured some Enigma machines, and there are some indications that they were actually reading Enigma messages. I think, and again I'm willing to be corrected on this by those who've researched this in more detail, I think the reason they were able to read Enigma messages is because they had also captured the monthly coding charts, which told the Germans how to set up their Enigma machines every day. That's very helpful when you capture it, but it's only good until the end of the month when the next sheet comes into force. And of course, last month's settings are no use for the next month. So it's quite possible that they were able to read messages for a few days before the sheet went out of date. And at least some of the expert papers that I've read indicate that that's how the Russians did it. I think the truth is that we really don't know, because the Russian archives are still largely a secret.
I've been intrigued by the Russian question. Given one could understand in the Blitzkrieg that in the West, Enigma machines were not sort of captured just in the debris of war, because the French and the British essentially were endlessly in retreat. Now, although the Germans advanced quite rapidly in Russia, there were periods when the Red Army counterattacked, and it seems to me slightly unlikely that an Enigma machine was not at some stage taken, certainly by the middle of the war, when you think of Stalingrad and so on. And I think I'm right, aren't I, that also the Russians used Enigma-like machines, both in the war and afterwards, rotor-driven.
Yeah, I think everybody was using rotor-driven machines, and your analysis is absolutely spot on. So we know that the Germans
captured a British Typex machine at Dunkirk in 1940. And I'm sure you're absolutely right, the Russians will have captured not just one but several Enigma machines as they began to push back against the Germans from probably the middle of 1942 onwards. So yeah, and they may have captured one earlier too.
I think also, though, that in fairness, the Germans, when they were analysing whether Enigma was being broken, as they did several times, it was always assumed, because they were used in the front line, that you could lose an Enigma machine, and the number of combinations was such that even having the machine was not a massive help without the tables to go with it.
This is Kirchhoff's, isn't it? Sorry, there are some cryptologists in the audience. So this is Kirchhoff's principle that you have to assume that the enemy understands the methodology for encryption, and so the piece that you need to keep secure is the key. It's the way that, if the key in an Enigma setting is how it's set up every day. So the key is the piece that you need to keep secret.
Sorry. Are there any, perhaps a final question, and then we'll pick up from Bletchley Park an update on where they've got to see how close they're getting towards the key of the day, and perhaps they can give us an update on whether they've got a stop and the progress from the stop onwards. Any final questions or comments that anybody'd like to make? No? Well, in that case, Dermot, we're delighted that you made the journey to come. It's been a great pleasure, and we'll look forward to hearing from you, no doubt, on future occasions on your researches on Enigma and related topics. So thank you very much indeed.